Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. I'm delighted to be joined on the Writer's Gym today by Dan Berlinka. Dan is a BAFTA-winning writer, director and producer. He co-created and co-wrote The A-List for Kindle Entertainment, Lionsgate and CBBC, for which he also directed 6 episodes, including both season finales. After season 1, The A-List was picked up and recommissioned by Netflix worldwide, with Dan as an EP over the series. Award-winning online mystery drama Dixie ran for 4 series on CBBC and won him a BAFTA in 2014. Dan's original children's comedy series Lagging debuted on CBBC in 2021 and ran for 2 more series, the third airing at the end of 2023. Dan was head writer for Itch, an adaptation of the Simon Mayo novel he developed for comics, now broadcasting on ABC Me, and which has been acquired by CBBC. Dan also developed Rhyme Time Town, an animation series for DreamWorks and Netflix, which is now streaming on Netflix. Dan also wrote Inspector Sunshine, a family movie produced by Perplexia Pictures and Great Point Media. His TV credits include episodes of Thunderbirds Argo for ITV, Casualty for the BBC, an episode he wrote, Get Even, CBBC and Netflix, BBC iPlayer, Shaun the Sheep, Aardman and CBBC, Hollyoaks, Lyman Channel 4, among many others. Dan Berlinka.
Hello.
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 Well, welcome to the Writer's Gym.
Thank you very much for having me.
I met you several years ago, and I feel like the number of wonderful things that about writing, directing, adapting, I almost don't know where to start, so I'm not going to choose where to start. I'm wondering if the way in might be to go chronologically. Did you always know that writing was the most fun thing to be doing?
No. I feel very lucky because writing was probably in my top 3 of things I wanted to do. When I was younger, I wanted to act. I liked acting very much. And it's going to sound so pretentious, but like as a teenager, I idolized Orson Welles, who did all 3, was an actor and a director and a writer. But I was not Orson Welles. And I learned that I didn't have the temperament and drive to be an actor. I've got tremendous respect for actors because that is hard what they do in terms of putting themselves out there. And my career, such as it is very much one of drifting into things. So I'll try and not make it the world's longest story. But at one point I thought I wanted to live in America, and I thought, a way of doing that is I'll be an academic. So I started doing postgrad. I did an MA in cinema studies, which taught me that I didn't want to be an academic. But through studying at an American university, I had the right to work for a year in my field, which again, at the time I thought was film. But I was applying for jobs, and the job I got was with the World Wrestling Federation as a production assistant. And that's how I got into television. And then when I came back to the UK, I had this television experience. And again, I'm jumping over loads of steps. But at some point, I got hired as a development producer in a small department at Disney Channel UK. And that's where I first started writing things, because part of the responsibility was to make short form content. Basically, American shows are 22 minutes, but Disney Channel didn't have commercial breaks, so they needed like 8 minutes of content to make things still land on a half hour. So they were always looking for little sort of 2-3 minute programs, and I was producing those. And at some point I started writing them, and then I moved into the promo department, where again you're writing short form content. I'll pause there, but that was the beginning of getting into writing. So I came to it relatively late. Up until I was about 30, I was sort of a jobbing producer, director, but very much in TV terms. Not directing drama, directing, pieces to camera and packages and little sort of, what would you call it? Sort of factual entertainment stuff for kids.
And that relationship, if you will, between the writer side of you and the director side of you, it's something I do find very interesting, because I was growing up in youth theatre and then stayed directing and acting, and that was the world that I'd fallen into, and I got distracted from writing. And I think what I've found since is where previously I would have written and directed, not at the level obviously that you do, but I did do that, but then I moved away from doing that because in my head, I wanted to know that a script was that fictional idea of direct proof, that it could stand, that it could communicate what I wanted it to without me having to be there. Then my former co-interviewer on the Writers' Gym, Emily Inkpen, her audio drama, she feels absolutely the opposite way. She absolutely wants to be the person that directs the writing. And then since then, I'm now doing my first visual one, and I've sort of come back the other way, that I've sort of held both points, but there are advantages to knowing how hard it is to act, to knowing what an actor needs from you. There's advantages to being the sort of, it's not being an auteur, but it sort of is, isn't it? It's having those two key ingredients at the same person.
So the directing I did earlier, apart from, giving me some familiarity with working with crews and so on, that was nothing compared to when I actually started directing drama. So I directed lots of voiceover and little animated series when I was doing this short form content. So I was used to working with actors. So I had some sort of basics there. And my dad had been an actor. If you look him up, his credits they're all bit parts. My favorite of my dad's credits is second Mexican. He wasn't even the first Mexican. He was the second Mexican. And actually, a film he was in is in re-release at the moment. My son was just saying we should go and see it. He's in Darling. He plays the projectionist of the sex film they go and watch in Paris. So those are the kind of things. But anyway, he had taught me sort of fundamental things like don't give actors line reads and, that mainly I think was the one that stuck. But yes, when I finally came to it and I was on this very low budget, initially web series, I did transfer to TV, Dixie, and I was very lucky to happen to be, we cast the very brilliant Claudia Jessie in the lead role, and she was just a phenomenal actor, basically, and brought so much to it. And I had a really, really lovely, supportive crew who knew this was my first drama. So the company had surrounded me by really, really experienced people that allowed me to concentrate on what I was doing, which was telling the story. And it was a found footage format, so it was an unusual way of shooting anyway. But it meant that it was a really good way of learning, because it was a low budget, stripped back kind of thing. So then by the time we did the A-list, which was on a bigger budget and a more conventional shooting style, had some fundamental understanding, but it was so liberating to move from found footage, because in found footage, you have to motivate every camera move because it's the character who's moving the camera around. Whereas on the A-list, we could just cut to reverse shots and so on. But definitely, I think directing made me a better writer because it gave me a much better understanding of just how difficult it is to shoot things and of how many setups you're basically asking people to do in order to do things. Because I remember watching an episode that I wrote of Hollyoaks Later, which was a big deal for me because it was my first sort of like grown-up drama credit. It was super fun because the episode that I was doing centered on what was basically a teen horror pastiche, so great fun. And I'd written this whole sequence that was very, I think, Halloween influenced. And when I was watching it with our mutual friend Robert Chandler, came round to my flat and we watched it together. And I was doing all of that. Oh, they changed this and they changed that, and I didn't quite write it like that. But he was great. He was saying like, stop doing that. Basically, it's still your episode. Things change when you film them, which was very good advice or good thing to remember. But it also made me realize when I came to it myself, it's like, of course they changed that sequence. I'd made it incredibly complicated and was going to take half a day to shoot, and they wouldn't have had half a day to shoot. So it changed my writing in as I was trying to think, how can I write this in such a way as it requires the least amount of setups? If they want to do more, they can do more. But when they've got the last hour of the day and they just need to get it done, how can I write it in such a way? How can I simplify the storytelling? And there are things you'll read in screenwriting books about don't direct on the page and so on. And I think that's good advice. When I'm reading stuff, I hate reading camera moves and camera angles and stuff like that because it just gets in the way of the storytelling. And I can't remember where it was I read this or heard this, but it said basically directors are wanting to find their vision. So if you say close up on Rachel, the director's going to go, I don't think this is a close up on Rachel at all. I think this is a long shot of Rachel. But if I say Rachel's eyes narrow, I'm telling them it's a close up without telling them what the camera angle is. I'm just telling them it's important that we see Rachel's eyes at that moment.
And you're doing something else as well that is maybe important to pick up on there is that you're giving the emotional truth rather than the literal truth. You're getting the intention rather than the icing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so one of the things I love about directing, particularly, I mean, most of the stuff I've directed has been stuff I've written or stuff that I've co-written, or on the A-list, I think I directed an episode that Nina Mativier wrote entirely, but we wrote the whole series together. So even if I didn't literally write that episode, I mean, we storylined it together. We both knew the intention.
And you came onto the A-list as co-writers, didn't you, having already had that relationship?
That's right. We were asked to come in and develop a teen show set in a summer camp that maybe had a mind control element. That's how the show was born. But yeah, I love, so I think something I'm good at is when I'm directing, the director side of me absolutely takes priority over the writer side of me, and I'm absolutely fine to cut lines, to not be married to the script, even if I'm the one who wrote it. It's no longer sacrosanct. It's all about the storytelling that we can do in the moment. And just coming back to a point you made earlier, in terms of, trying to get it the way you wanted it. The joy of it for me is one of two things. So sometimes on a good day, well, both of these are good days actually, but sometimes the actor will deliver the line, you've cast them well, and they deliver the line exactly the way you heard it in your head. You're like, yes, brilliant, that's great, that's what I've always been hearing. But other times, the actor will find something in this line and do a read that wasn't at all your intention, but it's better than your intention. They found something in it that you didn't even know was there. And that's really exciting too. I remember this young actor, he was 17 or something, and it was like a really not particularly great joke that I'd written. It was okay, it was serviceable, but it was fine. And then when we were running lines, he found something in it that I didn't know was there, and that was just absolutely joyous. That's why I like working with actors.
You're reminding me of when that happened in a very, very literal way to me when I was about 18. I was going for a walk with my boyfriend, and it was when the Spice Girls were very big, and for some reason Emma Bunton was on a poster that we walked past, and he said something that I found enormously funny, which was along the lines of careers, and that maybe one day you'll be singing at the Rodent's Crown in Croydon. And I laughed so much at that brilliant pub name that wasn't a pub name, the Rodent's Crown. And he didn't laugh with me all that much, and I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except that somehow later we traced back those thoughts to that question. Turns out he just said the Rose and Crown. So who made the joke?
That's an interesting one, yeah.
I think as a writer, that was a nice thought for me to play with. And going back to that writer-director thing, it's so good hearing you say that when you are both of them, it means that the director part of you has almost maybe more freedom to know that you sacrifice what's more in favour of what is most significant, what is deepest.
Absolutely. And you find that again in edit. As writers, I think, particularly screenwriters, I can't speak to novels, but we're desperately afraid sometimes that the audience won't get it. So we write a kind of a run-up line to express the idea, then the line that expresses the idea, and then a sort of follow-up, shoring it up kind of line. And then when you edit, you realize, particularly if your actors are good, you don't need those other lines. You know, that sort of that cliche of like, oh, you can do it with a look or whatever. There's absolutely truth to that. But there's also those little scaffolding lines that you put around the actual important line that has the plot point in. The actor does that because they bring the emotion, they bring the look and all the rest of it. So in edit, that's the other place where just swathes of dialogue. By the way, when you were handing in the shooting script and they were saying it's still over, and you did your last round of cuts and you've said, that's it, I cannot possibly cut another line from this. You're in edit and you find you can actually cut loads of lines from this still because we overwrite. So there's on set where sometimes you just change a line because it's not working, or the facts on the ground are such that you need to change the line slightly because the blocking has become different, just practical reasons. But then in edit, that's where you realize, oh, God, this scene is dragging a bit. Can we not? Actually, we could just lift this whole bit out. It doesn't matter. It's clear what they're saying, stuff like that.
And it's lovely, and I do definitely find that in prose as well. It's actually really refreshing when you've slaved over how can I lose this word or two, and then you go, the whole thing can go, and it flows better. That feels like a lift.
There does come a point when you're cutting stuff where once you've started cutting deep into the stuff that was really, really precious to you, once you've crossed that Rubicon, you start going, well, do we actually need any dialogue at all? Because you start cutting everything. Once you've started cutting your favorite lines, then nothing's sacred anymore. I do really enjoy that part of the process as well. How it gets reshaped in the edit. And again, I've worked with some really, really good editors. And yes, we're following the script, but sometimes things work on the page and they didn't quite work either because of your budgetary limitations, because the script is asking you to imagine what it's going to end up like. But sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes the scene that you thought would be riveting is actually a bit dull. So you have to adapt to that.
Or indeed vice versa, like you said about that, the way that actor delivered that particular line, there can be surprises and you will have to make room for the surprises sometimes.
No, absolutely. So that for me is the exciting nature of the whole thing, the whole collaborative aspect of it. You know, what I love about it is when you have all these people and everybody has their individualized job, and then they come in and they do that job, and they are all essential and they are all part of making that thing and telling that story.
Absolutely. From the writer's gym point of view, and around writing health and the fact that when we do something regularly in manageable chunks rather than exhaust ourselves one day, then nothing, finding healthy writing balances. I'm wondering, how was that for you? I realise now it's been a career long enough that does change the feelings, but I'm also thinking maybe, or does it? What have you found supports, motivates you?
My bank balance.
And does getting a BAFTA make your confidence better and stronger? Or does it return like I find most things do for most people?
Oh, no, it was a boost. Awards are definitely a boost, but I've also been on awards juries. You know that sometimes the winner is the one that people hated least. I've been on juries where there was one faction wanted one show and the other faction wanted the other show, and neither would back down. So the compromise show came through.
I've got to say, I have a bet with myself about this, because everyone I speak to, no matter what they have achieved, will find a way of essentially saying, oh, it's not that big a deal. I thought, Dan has a BAFTA. Let's see how he does this. And I've just won my bet with myself because you have.
Don't like to brag, but I have two
more
BAFTAs.
than one. Yeah, sorry, yes, you do. Actually, which brings me to the important point that I'm taking knowledge for granted, and let's not do that. Would you talk us through your BAFTAs, please?
Well, the first one was for Best Animated Children. They're both children's BAFTAs, same statuette, and it was for a tiny little short form thing that me and my business partner, at the time we had a small production company, and we did a thing for Disney Channel, 8 times 2-minute little cartoons. I voiced the cartoon as well, called Brushhead, and it came from a character that had been used in some promos, and we developed them into these little slapstick cartoons. I mean, it was work for hire, really, and it won a BAFTA for Best Animated Children's Series, and that's a great example, because we were nominated for like the British Animation Awards and we didn't win, and it was more or less the same nominees for the BAFTA, and on this one we did win. And I think, to be honest, everything else was probably a returning series or based on existing IP, and ours was a bit new and it was original, and it was good, by the way. I'm very proud of it. But we won for that, and then for Dixie we won. It will have a winner, but it was basically Best Interactive something or other. Because Dixie was this whole project that it was online, but it was in a fake website, so viewers could talk to the characters as if they were talking to them on Facebook.
And unlock achievements and things.
Well, yeah, all of that kind of. I mean, at the time, it was lucky that we did it when we did, because it was just, let's see, it was 2013, we filmed it, and went out in 2014. So any later, and you'd be developing that with Instagram or TikTok or somebody like that, you know, it was just at the right moment. And some of the money came from education to promote Internet Safety Day. There was an educational aspect to it. So it's immensely gratifying, and everybody's really nice to you for a bit afterwards, but it doesn't really change anything. And to your question about, like, does it make the imposter syndrome go away? No, not at all, because you still fail, you still have scripts that don't work, you still have scripts that don't sell, and you still have days where you sit there and think, I've forgotten how to write, I'm no good at this anymore. You might think, I was good at it before, but I'm terrible at it now, you know. So
it finds a way,
changes.
Doesn't it? The language in your brain, the thoughts we put on top of the feeling change, but the feeling is for life. It's just what changes is how you respond to it, how you notice that that's there and deal with.
Yeah, and so I suppose from a health point of view, I remember years ago, friend of mine asked me to speak at a sort of alternative careers fair in a school, and the idea, some charity she was working for, you know, like a school careers days, it tends to be like the banks and the army and, you know, a few big corporations.
The stuff
or whatever.
people have heard of.
And so they were trying to bring in other stuff, and I was sitting there to represent, why not write for television? And most people that came around dutifully with their little notebooks, these would have been year 11, 12, something like that. So sort of 16, 17-year-olds. So a lot of them were saying, like, what qualifications do you need? I was like, it's not really about that. It's not quite how it works. It's like there are people with lots of fancy pieces of paper, and then there are people who left school at 16. It's not really a qualifications job in that sense. But there was one person I remember, very earnest, who said, but how do you know? How do you know if what you've done is any good? And I was thinking, you don't.
Yeah.
You never know. And I'm thinking that's a writer. She's going to be a writer one day, because that anxiety. So I suppose, how do you know? I work in commercial television, so the only sort of measure I have is people give me money for it. That doesn't mean that it's objectively good. It just means that's the counter, that's the clicker, that's the achievement you're trying to unlock. But you never really know. In terms of the health of it, is that I suppose what I try to do. So at the moment, I, amongst other things, but I have like a little spec script project that I'm doing, which is a found footage horror, and I'm doing it because if I finish it and it's any good, I could probably put it together for not that much money, is basically, and I'm just itching to do something. And honestly, at the moment, I don't think it's very good, because I'm writing it very piecemeal. I mean, like, literally just before I came to meet you, just before I sort of texted to say, oh, I'll just quickly make myself a coffee, I think I had like 25 minutes. I was like, well, let's see how much of this found footage thing I can write in 25 minutes. And it was about, as a first AD would say, sort of 2/8 of a page or something. But anyway, the point is, I don't think it's very good. I don't know. I think there are bits of it that are all right, but I won't know until I get to the end. And the thing, I suppose, of experience is I do have faith I can get to the end of this, and then when I read it back and I make notes, then I can see what's wrong with it. And I do have faith that I can make it better. It might not be good the first time, but I'm confident that I can make it better on the second go.
And part of that experience, as you've described it, is knowing that those 25 minutes that you've grabbed are a very good way of making things better. That rather than it has to be better now. I mean, the image in my head is always layering the canvas. You
That's a good way of putting it.
You keep building it, and those 15 minutes while waiting for this to happen, or 5 minutes or 25 minutes, they do build up.
Yeah, and I did an adaptation of a YA novel, which has had some lovely responses, and the producer I did it for is still hopeful, but we haven't got it away yet. But when I was doing it, it was a real slog. I was struggling with it because, with no disrespect to the source material, but it was very internal monologue-y, so not a lot actually happened. It was just lots of feeling. So I realized I needed to invent a lot more plot than I thought I would have to, because the premise of the book was great. It's sort of, remember the film Ghost with Patrick Swayze? It's sort of that, but YA, but not. But just to give you an idea. Anyway, so I was struggling through it, and I got to the end, and it was probably like 120 pages or something, because it was messy as hell. And then I read it back, and it was so obvious which bits were just like little dead ends. I'd started writing something, but it didn't go anywhere, so that could just come out. And on the first of the next passes, where I just took out everything that was bad, already it was like a much more manageable length, and the stuff that remained was better. And then it was clear, oh, well, you need to do, a dialogue pass on this character and so on. And it came out quite, I was really pleased with how it came out. I mean, so many people say this, but, writing is hard, editing is fun.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. Just before coming on here, I saw a Facebook post from an author quoting another author, both of whom will remain anonymous. But what he said, he was commenting on a tweet that he'd seen where the new writer had said, I finished the first draft, that's the hard bit done. And that the experienced writer was saying, I couldn't bear to say, no, that's the fun bit done. And I thought, that's not about experience. That's completely subjective. There are people who find different things more fun. For some people, the first draft will be the hard bit. For other people, the first draft will be the joyful bit. It's just not the same for everyone. And it's not necessarily the same for every thing you create.
I completely agree. I saw Nina earlier today, and we were talking about really how lucky we were on the A-list, and that was partly because of very supportive execs, and partly because there just wasn't time to outline things to death. But we would do basically sort of like a 5-page outline slash beat sheet, not a scene by scene, but that just said, like, broadly, this is what happens in this episode. And that would get signed off, and then we'd just go away and write it, and it would change. We'd get to script very quickly, which I prefer. Like in my own spec stuff, I don't outline at all, basically, but that's because it's for me. Sometimes this can go wrong, but I'll have an idea, and then I'll just start writing it, and then I stare into space and imagine, I wonder what happens next. Maybe this happens. All right, I'll write that. And I like it as a method. It's quite high risk because if you go wrong, you go really wrong. I did one recently, and about halfway through, I realized that I'd been doing it entirely wrong. Normally, I wouldn't change it until I got to the end, but in this occasion, I realized I'd gone wrong, as it were. But the point is, you can sort of see it evolving, and you have a sort of an innate sense of structure, and you know this has been going on a bit. Something should have happened by now, and particularly when I'm doing more genre stuff, I'm a firm believer in a scary movie, something scary should happen, fairly regularly. So yeah, and just sort of writing as you go. So that can be joyful, but it can also just be a real slog where you're bogged down. And in fact, that one where I said, oh, I went wrong, that was a good example of one where I was just chipping away at it whenever I had some downtime, half an hour here, whatever. So I might enjoy individual scenes, but I didn't really think it was coming together. And then suddenly there's a sort of a delicious moment where you go, I can see the end of the episode from here. This was for an hour-long drama. Yeah, and I finished it, and then I polished it, and then it came out all right.
Can I ask you about that? Because it's so interesting hearing you say that you gave them a light premise and it got signed off and that was lucky, because I felt watching it that it was very free. I felt the character development did feel very natural is entirely the wrong word, because obviously everything is constructed, but it felt freer than a lot of things I see. And I'm wondering if that's a correlation. It feels like one. And I'm wondering, though, how does that work with two writers? Because that's two separate brains, and how does that play into it as well?
So Nina and I had done 4 series of Dixie together, so we had a good way of working. On that show, we had developed basically like a house writing style. So on the A-list, there are episodes we wrote individually, and then there are episodes we wrote together. And on the ones we wrote together, we would literally divide the episode in half. We would one of us would write the outline, this beat sheet, and then we would go, okay, I think the midpoint's here, so you write up to there, and I'll write from here to there. And then so we'd be writing our halves at the same time, and then we'd join them together. Like the old Morecambe and Wise bit, you can't see the join, but nobody ever could tell which half was Nina and which half was me. So that's just on a technical level. We had a way of writing that was just, as I say, this kind of house style. But we would storyline it together with our exec producer and our script editors, and it's not to say we didn't have disagreements and so on. The way we did that show was the schedule was such that, unlike some shows where you work out all the episodes in advance, on series 1, we'd done 2 pilot episodes as part of the development for the BBC, and then the rest of them we were just kind of on a schedule. Would come in, would break an episode, and then would go away and write it. And then while notes were happening on that one, we would break the next episode all in the room together. So it was very organic. It wasn't plotted out in advance. I remember being quite annoying. So because I'd done Hollyoaks, I was being very Hollyoaks about everything. And I kept going, what's the hook? What's the hook? The hook needs to be bigger. And then Nina would get annoyed and angrily come up with something brilliant. And that's one of the reasons why that show has such insane hooks, because we kept pushing. It was kind of like a rule. End of every episode should just turn everything upside down. It should. So we burnt through our loose idea of a plot where, by episode 7, this will happen. It's like that happened in episode 3. So we were just constantly burning through story, but we were doing character stories at the same time. And we had very off the shelf teen drama characters in a way, but then we sort of, we got to know them, and and their personalities just came through the writing. I don't know how else to put it. It really did come through the writing. And that show, which was a genre show, but we would always say, what's the non-genre version of this story? Because in some ways, it's teen romance and teen bullying was sort of the show, and then there's a supernatural element on top of that. So we would often try and work out what's the emotionally true version of this story, and then we'd chuck the supernatural element on top of that, which is, I think, maybe what made it feel like the characters were sort of grounded in something believable, even though unbelievable things were happening around them. Maybe, I don't know.
At the risk of massive oversimplification, the first series of the A-list is folk horror to me.
Yes,
whereas
predominantly, yeah, with other elements. Yeah.
Oh no, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I say this is going to be oversimplification.
No,
but
that's
I'm
fine.
Curious.
I'm offended. Yeah.
I am curious because it moves to a more traditional feeling of ghost story, and I'm trying to say this without any spoilers whatsoever for anybody who is a little bit slow on the uptake and hasn't seen it yet. Yeah. Was that the decision going in? Was that network related? How did that affect? Was that the effect of what you two discovered, or was that happy accident?
So it's a bunch of things. So I'm, as you know, a major horror fan. So, and Nina likes horror as well, but she hasn't seen as many films, but she was a big Buffy fan, so that was probably a big touchstone for her. And for me, it was like, the entire history of horror films. So a lot of times we would just go, oh, we could do this bit from this thing that we love. So there's a bit in series 1 that we always called the reverse carry, which is where Amber tips a bucket of red paint over her own head and stuff like that. And bear in mind, we were trying to do a show that could be seen by a younger audience as well. So there was always a limit to how far we could push things. So our big drug-fueled rave isn't a drug-fueled rave. It's Amber making everybody behave that way, but there's nothing illicit consumed. So people can, it can still have depending on which territory, a 10 or a 12 rating. Some of the folky stuff was inherent in, we were going to be shooting it in the summer camp location. So that and that was sort of a given. That was part of the brief. And we shot series 1 in Scotland, and it just happened to be the most unseasonably beautiful summer that the crew kept saying it's not normally like this. So it had this beautiful sun-drenched feeling, and the costume designer did a really lovely job and the props department on creating some of those elements.
It's some of the most beautiful plant monsteriness I've ever seen. I mean,
it's nice. So we were in the woods. So some of that folk element just comes from the location. And then for series 2, which we shot in Wales in the autumn, so we didn't have that kind of luxury of we wanted to be indoors a lot more, although we were outside and it was freezing as well. So we had some of those folk elements, but we were also, for a variety of sort of plotting reasons, we had decided we would set it in this kind of institute. It wasn't a COVID allegory at all, but we suddenly realized we were writing this during COVID, and the plot had naturally taken us to a point where a bunch of the characters were being held after the events of series 1. They're being held in this institute. And we realized while we were writing, it's like, oh, this actually mirrors our experience and probably the experience of the audience as well. They're effectively in lockdown, which is why we had one character learning Spanish and so on, and everybody going a bit stir crazy. Yeah. And then because we had to pay stuff off, yes, it was a mixture of some ghosty stuff. There's always been a sort of sci-fi-ish. I wouldn't call it sci-fi, but there is some sort of sci-fi gubbins in it. There are scientists and unusual chemicals and
good intentions.
Yes, and radical procedures. And I've always been, and I think Nina feels the same way, just always been a sucker for a redemption story. So we started working towards that. It was actually quite organic, because the difficulty about doing a series 1 is we had a lovely journey for our main character, and then she'd been on that journey and she'd completed it. So it's quite difficult for season 2. Is well, how do I get back to everything we loved about that character before she realized that she was flawed and learnt and became a better person? The better person isn't as much fun to watch, so we had to contrive ways to get back the fun side of that character, and that involved splitting her off from other characters. So it was quite organic in that way, I think.
And something else that I think for Writers' Gym members and listeners that I think is a really useful and wonderful thing to hear is we can waste so much energy on what kind of a writer am I? Am I a horror writer? Am I a children's writer? And what you're talking about is such a brilliant example of the fact that is not a separation anybody ever needs to make. We bring everything about who we are to our jobs, and it informs our storytelling. It would be patronising to children not to have the fact that there is romance, there is horror, these things are in the world. And yes, we manage how we express them for different ages. But at no point is it, am I this kind of writer, am I that kind of writer? You're a writer, you're creating 3D people always.
That's absolutely right. And because I came to it quite late and I was just really excited to write anything at all, now I maybe specialize in certain things a little bit more. But even now, and because of just the commercial realities, is that fundamentally I'm happy writing almost anything. I don't think I'm a natural fit for continuing drama. I've done some, and I've worked with people who are really, really brilliant at that, and I think I can do it. It's not my natural home. But, I've written animated comedy, I've written live action comedy, I've written preschool, I've written soap, and I've written traditional kids adventure drama and so on. And the joy is in the writing. And again, I'm sorry to keep sounding so mercenary, but the joy is in getting paid to write. That's really lovely. When somebody gives you money to do this, it's not a bad way to spend a day.
And good critical reception is also not unpleasant.
Yes, but I don't really work in the places where we're getting that kind of critical acclaim. The audience loving it means a huge amount, and that's what's lovely about writing for a young audience. That thing of like very common, particularly like if people go away to university. I remember so many conversations where you sit around and talk about programs you liked when you were 10 or 11 or whatever. So if you can write one of those that will give people those memories, because it's an audience that feels things really, really deeply. And so writing emotional truth, which is something you talked about, is very important. And, I'm a big softy when I'm writing, and on a really good day, you write something that ideally will keep the audience on the edge of their seat, make them laugh and make them cry. And if you can do all of that in the same scene, that's wonderful.
You've made me realise how unfaithful I have been to Aardman by not talking about Shaun the Sheep. And I think we need to rectify that for a moment.
I'm very happy to talk about Shaun the Sheep. They were lovely people to work with. Aardman are lovely to work with, and it was one of my first proper writing jobs, doing something for somebody else where it would end up on television. And the way they did it was so nice. You and another writer, in this case it was me and Andy, were writing as a team. I don't know if they still do it that way, but you'd go down to Bristol and there'd also be a writer who was also doing an episode. You'd all just sort of spitball together. You'd have come with some ideas, or maybe there was an idea that they kind of already liked, but you'd spitball it with the Aardman team, and Golly would sit there and he'd be drawing while you were talking, and you sort of just outline it all together, and everybody's really generous, and the other writer would be generous too, because I don't like writers' rooms where you then go away and you're now going to pitch for an episode, because then all the writers are competitive and nobody's really helping each other because they're trying to make sure that they get an episode. But here, you'd been commissioned, you knew you were going to get an episode, so it was just about figuring out what the episode was. So you'd all work together in this very collaborative way, and you'd make some notes, and then you'd go away and you'd write it. And there's a particular format for writing Shaun the Sheep, obviously. I remember somebody one time lurching up to me a bit drunkenly at a party, be like, "Hey, you say you write Shaun the Sheep?" I was like, yeah. No words in Shaun the Sheep, like a big gotcha. I was like, yeah, and I wrote the story, wrote, the visual gags. But anyway, so that's what you do. So you're writing basically stage directions. But again, talking about a collaborative process, what they then bring in terms of animation. So an episode we did called Supersized Timmy, which was basically a sort of Jekyll and Hyde / King Kong pastiche, where Timmy ate some tomatoes that had like a growth serum on them and then became monstrous supersized Timmy. In the script, it would have been like one line about this miracle grow being put on the tomatoes. In animation, this was like a whole lovely little 10-15 second sequence of the tomatoes starting to grow. So much of that would be embellished by the animators. But, so you're writing a blueprint for them, but then there's a whole other layer, which I suppose in a way is true of everything, right? I mean, live action, drama, whatever, but particularly there, because the animation is so beautiful, there are things where you've no idea when you're writing this stage direction that an animator is going to be inspired by that and turn that into so much more than you knew it could be when you wrote it. They were really lovely to work with. And I still, Facebook friends that I haven't spoken to in however long, I'll suddenly get a message saying I was watching Shaun the Sheep with my kid and your name popped up, which it's a great show. I have to say that as a writer is one where I feel, and normally writers are not shy about taking credit, but that's one where as a writer I feel like you can take the least credit because it's so collaborative and so much of what's great about it is happening at the animation end, not at the writing end.
And that does lead back to what you said near the beginning about how there's more in everything that we write than we are going to know until it is shared in somebody else's hands, until that is a collaboration. Even when that's you as a director, that's not quite the same as you as a writer. That's a collaboration, whether somebody else is directing or not. It's lovely hearing how these things grow. And it is a bit like, I mean, you have actual biological children, which I do not. So I don't know how strongly you feel the comparison works, but it is about letting things surprise you, isn't it? Letting them do their own thing.
Well, my scripts are a lot better behaved than my children. But
although one of your children helped you with the Buffy references, so
That's true. That's true. There are so on a bad day when you feel that your work is not being treated the way you want it to be, weirdly that's where that child metaphor feels most apparent in a way, because it can be really viscerally upsetting. The more attached to something you are, the more upset you get if it ends up not coming out the way you envisage. It depends what it is. If it's work for hire, and I'd like to think I'd never phone it in, but if it's a long-running, continuing drama or whatever, and you do, so I've done some episodes of Casualty. That's not my show. That's their show. So I'm trying to give them the best episode that I can write.
And
but
sort
ultimately,
of on their terms, fundamentally.
On their terms, absolutely. But on things that I've created, it's more emotionally difficult sometimes. Sometimes, with hindsight, you go, oh, you know what? They were right. I thought this, but actually that was a good note. But other times it's a clash of whose vision it is. I do think it's important that somebody has the vision. I also think it is important to have some boundaries around you. I don't think writers necessarily do their best work when they have absolute complete freedom. It's about having the right tension between your desire to write your vision, but a little bit of pushback, a little bit of limitation, whether it's the budget, whether it's the network or whatever. Like, I'll give an example. I wrote a sequence for a show called Get Even. It wasn't my show. I was just a writer on it, but it was a really lovely writer's room run by Holly Phillips, was the head writer. It was a murder mystery, so there was an episode that I was writing where it was revealed that a character had died, and I wrote what I thought was really lovely, sad death montage, basically, with everybody grieving, and it was really nice. It was wordless, sort of music montage-y kind of sequence. And the network were like, yeah, this is super depressing. Nobody wants this. That's not the show we wanted. Just like 5 minutes of people grieving. So we had to do something else. And the something else, I think, was actually much better than what I'd written originally, even though I really liked what I'd written originally.
And also, nothing ever goes in the bin, does it? You might find that tomorrow that scene turns up in something that comes next that you don't even know about yet.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's funny, isn't it? There are things where on the day you get the note, you're like, I cannot possibly change this. Why are you people making me change this absolutely beautiful, perfect thing? And then a week later, you're like, oh yeah, no, that's fine. When we were doing lagging, I would often have favorite bits, and I would say to my co-exec producer, who ultimately was the really great producer called John Rolfe, sometimes I was like, can I leave it in on this pass? And then I'll look at it again on the next one, because basically I wasn't ready to cut it yet. But by the next pass, I was like, oh yeah, that's fine. I can cut that. Sometimes it's just about having enough time to let it go. I just finished a thing with my dear friend and collaborator, writer called Sean Carson. We've done a lot of stuff together. Did a lot of preschool together. Sean's a brilliant preschool writer. Has a show on CBeebies at the moment called Yuki, which is just adorable. But we've been writing a sort of Only Murders in the Building-esque thing. I have to say, I was working on it long before Only Murders in the Building. But now that Only Murders in the Building has happened and been such a success, it's got optioned because now there's an appetite for this kind of show. Anyway, the point is we just finished the latest draft and we have great fun working together. We think the script is really good, and it's at that moment, it's in some ways it will never be better than that moment on Wednesday morning when we were finishing off and writing the email to send it to the company that optioned it, because right now we're in that, how could anybody turn this down? This script is perfect. It's a delight, and it will never be better than that moment. From this, there is nothing but disappointment from this point on. But right now, in that moment where we did the last, let's renumber the scenes, that script, and it's in our heads and we can see it, and it's the best it will ever be.
And then it goes out into the world, and the world shapes and changes it, but it still exists. It's going
Well,
out there.
and the reality is that the world probably says, "No, I don't really fancy it. We don't really want it." I was working with Murray Hunter at one point. Me and Andy were developing a sitcom with him. It was his idea. Eventually, we weren't involved anymore, but it happened as a Radio 4 sitcom. But we were involved when it was being developed for TV. So we were involved in developing the characters and the pilot script. And it was a really good pilot script that Murray had written. And at one point, he said, "Do we have to send it out? Can we not just keep it here and just look at it occasionally?" And it is that feeling of the vulnerability, but ultimately you do want things to get made. You want to reach an audience, and I think I'm very interested in your question about writing health. It is difficult, but just to tell you what works for me, so I treat it very much like a job because my writing career kind of coincided with having young children. There was a natural sort of built-in shape to the day. So, and again, I'm not knocking anybody. Some writers write all through the night. I don't. I work basically a 9 to 5 or sort of, it's more like well, I would say that writing is structured a lot like a day of test cricket. But anyway, it's sort of, nothing really starts until 11 and, the lunch and then the tea break and so on. And I have a nap after lunch as well, because I've realized that I can't really productively write more than about 5 or 6 hours a day. But yeah, I sit there and I type, sometimes I sit there and I have to force myself to just sort of think and make notes and so on. But I'm always itching to write. I have to be careful not to write too soon. But I just do it every day. And on the best days, I'm doing it for somebody who's paying me to do it. But I do treat it as my job. So if there's a day where sometimes I'll bunk off and I'll go to the movies or something. But broadly, Monday to Friday, I work. I always say I don't work evenings and I don't work weekends, which is true unless we're in production, in which case all bets are off. But I just treat it like a job. And if I'm not working for somebody else, then I should be writing a spec, because even if it doesn't sell, it's a new writing sample for my agent to take to people. And write something that she doesn't already have. The last thing I wrote on spec was an hour-long thriller, psychological thriller. So the next thing, I don't know what it will be, but it won't be that.
Is there any writing exercise, ritual that you would flag wave to other people? Anything that works for you?
Not really, other than just doing it and doing it whether you feel like it or not waiting for inspiration to strike. Something I had to learn in some ways from my friend, the writer Brian Dooley, brilliant writer. He talked about going for walks when he was stuck, and I used to be very bad at allowing myself the think times, as I say, because sometimes I try and force it. So that's the only thing, is being aware that just going for a walk could actually also count as working. And since I've developed healthier habits and I do my little morning exercises, that's been great, because often, and I don't deliberately try and think about the thing I'm working on, but sometimes it will just pop into my head and a problem will get solved that way. And it's a bit of a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. It's very good for mental health as well. So I do this little exercises in the park, and just getting out of the house and experiencing whatever the weather is that day. That I find very good for me. Yeah, and I'm very routine driven, and I'm also quite, if it's a piece of commercial writing on a deadline, having page count targets, which is between 5 and 6 pages a day, which is not that much, but there are days when you'll struggle to hit that. Where some people will do, I wrote 15 pages in one sitting. I'm not like that. It's ideally 2 or 3 before lunch and then 2 or 3 after lunch, it feels quite manageable that way. But that's, again, because of the way some people do that. I hate the phrase vomit draft, but some people do that. Even though I said, the fun part is the editing, I am trying to make it good first.
I love the vomit draft.
But I'm not always, I don't always succeed in making it good first time, but I am trying to write the best line I can each time.
Why do you hate vomit draft?
Oh, no, I just hate the expression.
Why?
Because I don't like the word vomit.
Fair.
So I'll call it like draft 0 or whatever. Bruckner had a symphony that he felt wasn't worthy of a number, so it's known as Bruckner's Symphony Number 0. So that's how I think of my first drafts. The first draft is the one that nobody sees. The first draft that I deliver is usually my second or third draft. Oh, that's the other thing I would say. And sometimes there's not time to do this, but whenever I'm agreeing a deadline, I'm trying to agree a deadline that gives me anywhere from 3 to 5 days after I know I will have finished it to be editing it. Yeah, this is quite a good thing to maybe encapsulate everything. I think you have to leave it ideally for longer, but sometimes you don't have the time, but you have to leave it overnight and reread it. And then ideally you have another night that you can leave it and reread it, because you will just keep catching things that you can make better. You need that little bit of distance, I think, because when you've just done it, you're too close to it. And I realize sometimes people have to do it, but for anyone who doesn't have to, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows this, but never go, the end. Brilliant. Done. Send.
That was wonderful. Dan Berlinka, thank you so much for joining the Writers' Gym.
Thank you very much for having me. This is really fun. I could have talked for another hour. Nobody talks to writers, so writers love talking.
It's been delightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope it's of some use to your viewers and listeners, and I think it's a great thing that you do with this Writers' Gym. So thank you for inviting me.
You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr. Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.